Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Autobiography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters, by Walt Whitman, read by Frank Blissett. Chapter 18. New as an adventure and situation of this sort were to Martha, she stood it like a heroine. I had never seen a woman's conduct more admirable, and from that moment my attachment, for such a feeling had already taken root on my mind, was colored with an esteem and respect which made it indeed true love. Previously, the sentiment had perhaps been composed more of pity and sympathy for the wrongs which were encompassing her, but the demeanor she exhibited in these incidents proved her worthy of a more solid regard and warmer friendship. Yes, it was while we were waiting there in that cheerless police room that the inspiration first came to me of a simple way to cut the knot at once, or at any rate to remove most of the complications and make the battle between Covert and Martha a decided one. I felt I knew that such a girl as this I could love. Indeed, I felt that I did love her now, and that my feeling was of that positive, real kind, equally without reserve, and devoid of morbid ardor. A feeling which I divined was the best and the only genuine feeling which should lead to marriage. I bethought me then, for though we waited but a few minutes, thought travels over space and time quick enough, and I bethought me of the little girl in the basement years before. I saw the scene before me, the good protectress in her plain cap and the smooth hair parted on her head. I thought of my early crony, Bill Jiggs, the good lady. Ah, how gently she washed that dirty head while I held the large basin of half-warm water. How the jagged wound made me almost feel sick, although one who helped bring Bill Jiggs in pronounced it not so much after all, and laughed, and said that it was more blood than anything else. How the lady looked around, and, finding nothing else handy, took that famous handkerchief, so large, so fragrant, of such beautiful white linen, and bound up Bill Jiggs's phrenological developments from the public gaze. Then how the little girl Martha came and neatly tied the knot with such tender fingers, for fear she might hurt the wound. Even then did she not exhibit the inward force and strength of her character? Wouldn't almost any other little girl have been frightened and held back in alarm? And thus and so, under a semi-arrest, and not knowing but what we would have to pass the night in durance, was determined the love of Jack Engle. In a few minutes the man who had brought us hither came up to us and asked for the bundle. He wished to take it away. "To that I must object," said Martha, turning to him, "and I do not know if thee has any right to do so." Martha was a different person to deal with from the boy Nat, and the officer felt it. "Then let the boy bring the things," said he, "and all of you come in here." We followed him into an adjoining room, At a little wooden table there was seated the captain of the district. The moment I saw him, I felt relieved, for he was an old acquaintance of Ephraim Foster's, and, besides, he and I knew each other well. Although older than I, he was yet a young man, and we had spent many months in the same studies at the public school. "What, Jack Engle?" he cried, looking up, and then turning to the man who had brought us in. "Oh, Jones, your trouble is all for nothing. These people cannot possibly be anything to that affair." "Well, if you know them," answered Jones, "that's enough, of course." The officer, in a civil tone, but without showing any vexation or disappointment, asked our excuses, said that the captain would tell us why he had been so particular, and then left the room. My school friend good-naturedly rose, and pushing his seat along to Martha, informed me how there had been a good deal of serious pilfering in that neighborhood, that from information obtained by the officers, he supposed a still more daring robbery was on foot that very night, and that a female was concerned with the parties in it. Their information was not exact enough to point them specifically to the premises endangered, nor to the thieves, but they were more than usually on the lookout. Under such circumstances, we happened to fall in the way of one of the most vigilant of the officers. The captain hoped we would have philosophy enough to overlook the annoyance. Martha's now cheerful face assured him that there was no great harm done. Truly, that face alone was enough for a passport of honesty through all the police stations of the land. Steady young man, as my friend had reason, I hope, to set me down for, from all he knew of my past life, one look at the aforesaid face was enough to reassure him against any suspicions from our situation. For although we were cleared of any darker imputation, there was something that might be supposed worth elucidating in being out at this hour of the night, or rather morning, scudding rapidly through the streets with a woman, a bundle, a boy, and a dog. But the captain did not by word of mouth ask any explanation, and as I did not think the real circumstances fitting to a voluntary recital of the facts, I bid him good night, and we departed. We soon reached the wharf, where Tom Peterson was on the alert for us. Nat's boat had not been disturbed, and I helped Martha down into it, and laid my overcoat over the seat for her to sit on. Jack entered with a bound after Nathaniel sprang in, and with a push from Tom off the pier, we were afloat. Then I felt relieved indeed. It seemed to me that we were now free from Covert's more direct machinations, at all events. He might plot as much as he liked, but his presence and the sound of his voice could not trouble us more. Martha, too, entered into these feelings. She had suffered much from her situation in Covert's house after his wife's death, although her simplicity and vigor of mind had shielded her from things that would have been sore trials to ordinary girls. Within the past few weeks, in particular, she had found growing up in her mind a settled repugnance to the lawyer. Her sentiment towards him, during the lifetime of his wife, had been one more deserving to be called indifference than anything else. She did not particularly dislike, but at the same time she had no attachment, and nothing more than a very ordinary respect for him. Since the developments of late, as was to be expected, she could no longer occupy a neutral position. Her character had a good deal of strong impulse in it, and this was directed in a manner anything but favorable toward her legal adviser and hitherto controller. We rowed out in the river, I poling on one side, Tom's oar on the other, and Nat acting as steersman. Jack was at the prow, with his nose elevated, and making quite a figurehead for our little craft. Martha looked upward at the sky, and evidently enjoyed the whole scene. Though there was no moon, the stars were shining bright. The fresh south breeze came pleasantly up from the Narrows, the water dashed in ripples against our boat, and altogether it was indeed a soothing and refreshing half-hour, after the hurry of Martha's escape and the stoppage at the police-house. Out in the middle of the river, we lay on our oars a few minutes, and enjoyed the scene still more. The long stretch of the city's shores were silent and hushed. 2 or 3 sloops, at various distances on the river, moved along, their white sails showing like great river ghosts, and not a harsh sound was to be heard. The Hoboken shore, too, was solitary and still. As we neared it, the just-risen moon shone out from a cloud and scattered a flood of light on the wooden banks, the water, and everything else. It seemed like a good omen, and, indeed, could hardly help having an effect on us all. The river up above, which had seemed like a path of darkness and doubt, was now sparkling. The sails of the sloops looked like things of real life again, and the round heights of Weehawken had their somber shadows touched up into varied gray and dark green. From a war vessel lying off Castle Garden came the sounds of bells striking the time, and the sonorous voice of the watch. We stepped ashore, full of spirits, and with the young blood in us aroused to the vigor of renewed life, and hope, and action. Tom and Nat tied the boat, and the latter took his bundle again, while the former remained until our return. Jack coursed to and fro like a mad creature. A good walk brought us, not at all tired, to Inez' cottage. She was up and expecting us. She kissed Martha on the cheek and welcomed her warmly. Our troubles and adventures were over for that night, at any rate. For, though Tom and I had to row back home, and had a good time in doing so, we hardly spoke a word, and met with nothing worth mentioning. I had hardly got in bed when I heard the advance movements of Ephraim, who was an early riser. That was Chapter 18 of Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Auto-Biography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters, by Walt Whitman. Read by Frank Blissett.